You think you've seen it all. You think nothing can surprise you anymore. But what if I told you that the greatest threat to your world is not what you've fought before? What if it's something you can't even comprehend? Something alien. And what if that alien could be standing right in front of you, laughing at your weapon, and mocking your every move? Max had always been underestimated. He'd been laughed at for his weak weapon, a tool that seemed pathetic compared to the weapons of others. But what the others didn't know was that his weapon was not just a tool, it was his fate. And when the mocking stopped, only one thing would remain: a precise strike. One that would shatter not just her armor, but everything she believed. Tonight, everything changes. For both of them. The sky trembled, an unnatural hum vibrating the air, as if the very atmosphere of Earth was protesting. Max stood still, eyes fixed on the horizon. The Kalarn were coming. He knew it. He could feel it deep in his bones. His military training had prepared him for battles against humans, against machines. But this was something else. Something that made even the bravest soldiers hesitate. In the distance, the first massive war machines of the Kalarn rose, towering above the trees. Their sharp, gleaming surfaces reflected the fading sunlight, casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. They were unlike anything Max had ever seen: impossible shapes, intricate designs, pulsing with energy. The ground trembled with each step they took. He wasn't alone. Beside him, a strange figure stood. A woman, taller than any human he had ever seen, her emerald skin almost glowing in the dim light. Astrid, the warrior from another world, another dimension. Her eyes, violet and intense, scanned the terrain with precision. She was the only one who could help him now. Max's breath caught in his throat as her gaze met his. There was something in the way she looked at him, something that pulled him in, a mix of curiosity and caution, but also something deeper. The Kalarn were a threat, yes, but the connection between him and Astrid felt far more dangerous. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice like velvet but carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. Max didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes followed the dark shapes in the distance. The world was about to burn, and he was about to fight beside an alien warrior who knew nothing about human emotions, let alone the intensity of what was brewing between them. "I'm ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But there was determination in it. The kind of determination that only came when the world was at stake. Max could feel her presence beside him, the quiet hum of her energy, the way she stood with a graceful yet powerful poise. She was like nothing he had ever encountered. And in that moment, he knew, his world would never be the same again. They had one chance. One chance to stop the Kalarn and save what was left of Earth. As the machines began to move, Astrid took a step forward. Her fingers brushed Max's arm, and a strange sensation shot through him. It wasn't just physical. It was a connection. It pulsed like a live wire. Neither of them spoke. But they didn't need to. They understood. The battle had begun. The ground shook beneath them, the deafening roar of the Kalarn war machines growing louder with each passing second. Max could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Astrid, standing beside him, was a perfect picture of calm in the chaos. Her eyes violet, like the stars themselves, never left the horizon, but he could sense her awareness of him. Every movement, every breath, was calculated. And yet, there was something about her, something that made his pulse quicken. "We can't hold them off forever," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the rumble of the approaching invasion. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We don't need to hold them off forever," she replied, her voice steady, yet something in it hinted at urgency. "We just need to make sure they don't reach the city." Max turned to face her fully, feeling the pull between them intensify. Astrid was more than just a warrior. She was something else. He could see the strength in the way she moved, the confidence in the way she spoke, but there was also a vulnerability beneath it all. A vulnerability that only appeared when she didn't think anyone was watching. Without another word, she stepped forward. Her boots sank slightly into the earth as she moved with that elegant, predatory grace. Max watched her for a moment, feeling an unexplainable pull. How was it possible for someone to be so alien and yet so familiar? "Stay close," she called over her shoulder, her voice barely carrying in the howling wind. Max snapped out of his trance. He nodded, quickly following her lead, stepping into the darkness with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The city they were trying to protect was in the distance, barely visible through the smoke and haze from the invading forces. Their only chance was to get there before the Kalarn did. They had no backup, no support. Just each other. As they moved through the dense, destroyed terrain, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was tension in the air, a silent understanding between him and Astrid that they both felt but couldn't yet name. Suddenly, they were ambushed. Max barely had time to react as one of the Kalarn's drone-like soldiers lunged at him. Its sharp, metallic claws swiped across his chest, leaving a trail of sparks as they made contact with his armor. He grunted, stumbling back, but Astrid was faster. She moved with inhuman speed, her energy crackling around her as she raised her hand. A burst of violet light surged from her fingertips, throwing the drone back, its body crumpling under the force. Max stood there, stunned for a moment, watching the way she moved, the way she controlled the raw power inside her. She turned to face him, her eyes intense, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. It wasn't just a look, it was an exchange, a connection that neither of them could ignore. Astrid's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, as if she could sense the shift between them. "We need to keep moving," she said, her tone softer now, but still urgent. Max didn't reply. He didn't need to. He only nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. They continued their journey, side by side, knowing that each step brought them closer to the heart of the battle. And yet, despite the chaos, there was a strange peace in the way they moved together. Their connection, however inexplicable, was growing stronger. It was in the way she protected him without hesitation, and in the way he trusted her completely, despite knowing nothing about her world, her past, or her people. Max and Astrid pushed forward, their boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground. The distant sounds of the war machines grew louder, a constant reminder that time was running out. Yet, as they moved, there was something more pressing between them. The way their steps fell in sync, the way they shared a glance without needing words, the connection was undeniable. Astrid was not just a warrior. She was something else. And Max couldn't deny the growing tension that simmered beneath the surface. Every glance, every subtle touch, they were moments Max tried to ignore, but couldn't. He could feel her presence, her energy, swirling around him like an invisible force. It wasn't just her abilities, it was something deeper. Something about her compelled him. Astrid didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice seemed to resonate with a power that made his chest tighten. "We'll need to find shelter soon," she said, her voice low and steady. They're closing in faster than we anticipated. Max nodded. The urgency in her tone was unmistakable. He didn't understand her world, her ways, but something about her gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't quite explain it, but being with her made him feel like he was part of something larger. Something bigger than just survival. As they moved deeper into the city's ruins, a sudden explosion rattled the air. Max dove to the ground, instinctively pulling Astrid down with him. Her body was pressed against his, her chest rising and falling rapidly as they lay on the cold concrete. Her warmth, her breath against his skin, felt foreign, but somehow comforting. He could feel her pulse racing beneath her skin, the raw energy she emitted almost overwhelming. For a moment, time seemed to slow. There, lying on the ground, surrounded by the chaos of war, they were something more than just two soldiers. They were two beings, connected in a way that went beyond the physical. Max's hand, almost without thinking, brushed against hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock through his entire body. Her eyes met his, violet and piercing, full of something that could only be described as recognition. Astrid didn't pull away. She didn't need to. The connection between them was palpable, like the crackling energy of a storm, waiting to break free. For a fleeting moment, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. The war, the destruction, none of it mattered. They were united in a way that felt almost fated. Then, the moment shattered. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped them both back into reality. Astrid was the first to rise, her body moving with swift precision as she scanned the area. Max, still in a daze, pushed himself to his feet, his heart still racing from the proximity of the woman beside him. "We need to move," Astrid said, her voice steady again, though Max could see the flicker of something deeper in her eyes. She was no longer the detached warrior from another world. She was human, in that brief moment. Just as lost and vulnerable as he felt. Max didn't argue. He followed her lead, the weight of the moment still heavy on his chest. The bond between them wasn't just physical anymore. It had become something more. Something neither of them could ignore. They moved together, side by side, as the rumble of the Kalarn war machines grew louder. The city ahead was still in ruins, but it was their last chance to make a stand. The only thing that mattered now was getting there, and getting there alive. The city was almost unrecognizable. Where there had once been bustling streets and towering buildings, now only ruins remained. The Kalarn war machines had left their mark on everything, their destructive forces tearing through the very fabric of Earth's civilization. The sky above was thick with ash and smoke, casting an eerie glow on everything below. Max could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. With each step, the ground seemed to tremble more violently. Astrid had been right, time was running out. They needed to reach the central command center if they stood any chance of stopping the invasion. But with every passing minute, it became clearer that this wouldn't be an easy fight. As they moved deeper into the heart of the city, Max's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what Astrid had said earlier: "We're not just fighting for Earth. We're fighting for survival, for the future of every living being." The reality of their situation hit him harder than ever. Beside him, Astrid was silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the Kalarn ships were descending. He could feel her unease, though she never let it show. She was a warrior, after all, trained to handle threats of unimaginable scale. But even she couldn't deny the overwhelming power of the enemy they faced. "We'll need to move fast," Astrid said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, calm, but Max could hear the subtle urgency behind it. The Kalarn are already preparing to attack the city's core. Max nodded, pushing aside the unease gnawing at him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about sacrifice, about doing whatever it took to protect what was left. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. Without warning, a sudden explosion shook the ground beneath them. Max barely had time to react before a Kalarn drone emerged from the rubble, its glowing red eyes locking onto them. It moved with terrifying speed, its metal limbs clashing against the ground, ready to strike. Astrid was the first to act. She raised her hand, and a wave of violet energy shot out, knocking the drone off balance. It staggered back, but not for long. The Kalarn soldier was quick to recover, its metallic body shifting as it prepared for another attack. Max didn't wait. He lunged forward, using the enhanced strength he had gained from his training. He grabbed the drone's arm, pulling it toward him. With a crack, the arm detached, and Max slammed it into the drone's chest. Sparks flew as the impact sent the machine crashing to the ground. "Nice move," Astrid said, her voice almost amused as she stepped over the wreckage of the fallen drone. Max wiped the sweat from his brow, still breathing heavily. "Didn't expect it to be that easy." Astrid smirked. "Nothing ever is." But there was no time for more words. They had to keep moving. The Kalarn were everywhere, and every second they spent here brought them closer to death. As they moved forward, side by side, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside of him. Astrid hadn't just saved his life again, she had become more than a mere ally. She was the reason he was still standing, still fighting. And though he couldn't quite define it yet, the bond between them was growing. It wasn't just about strategy or survival anymore. It was about trust. And maybe even something more. As they reached the outskirts of the Central Command Center, the Kalarn forces began to close in, the battlefield growing darker with every passing second. Max and Astrid exchanged a brief glance. No words were needed. They both knew what was at stake. They had one chance to end this. Together. The city was in chaos, the once vibrant streets now reduced to a desolate wasteland. Every corner seemed to hide a new danger, every shadow a potential threat. The Kalarn forces were closing in, their war machines stomping relentlessly, tearing apart anything in their path. Max and Astrid moved through the ruined city, side by side, every step heavy with the weight of the world. They were no longer just two soldiers fighting for survival. Now, they were something more. Something fated. Max's eyes scanned the surroundings. The destruction was unimaginable. The Kalarn had been thorough, nothing was left untouched. He could feel the weight of their advance pressing down on him, but he refused to falter. The stakes were higher than ever. "We need to get to the underground tunnel," Astrid said, her voice cutting through the noise of the battle. Her violet eyes locked onto him, determined but full of a quiet, hidden fear. "It's our only chance." Max nodded, already moving faster. They had no time to waste. The tunnel was their last hope, but it was deep within enemy territory. It wasn't going to be easy. They ran, dodging debris and the occasional explosion that shook the ground beneath them. Max's heart raced, his mind focused only on one thing: getting to the tunnel before the Kalarn reached them. As they neared the entrance to the underground network, a loud crash sounded behind them. A Kalarn drone appeared from the rubble, its massive, hulking form casting a long shadow over the street. Its glowing red eyes locked onto them, and it charged. Max barely had time to react. Astrid, however, was already in motion. Her body moved with the speed of lightning, faster than he could follow. She threw her hand forward, sending a wave of energy surging toward the drone. But it didn't go down easily. The energy blast collided with the drone's armor, sending a shockwave through the street, but the drone didn't fall. "Move!" Astrid shouted, her voice low and urgent. She turned to Max, eyes blazing with intensity. Max grabbed her arm, pulling her into the entrance of the tunnel just as the drone charged again. They sprinted down the narrow, dark path, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. But the sound of the Kalarn war machines was growing closer. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they ran, the intensity between them became palpable. Max could feel Astrid's energy, her power pulsing around them like a storm. It was almost overwhelming. She was a force of nature, a warrior in every sense of the word. But it wasn't just her power he felt. It was something deeper. Astrid was more than a warrior. She was someone who had been shaped by an entirely different world. Her struggles, her battles, they were far beyond anything Max could comprehend. But here, in this moment, they were equal. They were two souls, fighting side by side, bound by fate. Max dared to glance at her, his heart pounding in his chest. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, everything around them seemed to stop. The destruction, the chaos, the Kalarn forces closing in, none of it mattered. It was just the two of them. The connection was undeniable. The tension between them had shifted. It wasn't just physical anymore. It wasn't just about survival. It was about something more. With a deep breath, Max took the lead, pushing forward through the tunnel. The sound of their breathing and the occasional echo of their footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence. But even then, they weren't alone. The weight of the world, of everything they had been through, was on their shoulders. They had one shot. One chance to stop the Kalarn. And it wasn't going to be easy. But Max knew one thing for sure: he wasn't facing this alone. And neither was Astrid. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of dust and old stone. The only sound was their breathing, ragged and uneven as they pushed forward. Max's muscles ached from the run, his body feeling the weight of the battle that had been raging around them. But it wasn't just the battle that weighed on him now. It was Astrid. He glanced at her, watching as she moved through the tunnel with the same quiet grace that had defined her from the moment they first met. Her violet eyes were sharp, focused, but there was something else in them now, something Max had seen before. A flicker of doubt, of uncertainty. For the first time since they had met, she wasn't the perfect warrior. She was a woman, vulnerable, just like him. "We need to make it to the core," Astrid said, her voice steady but with an edge of tension that Max didn't miss. "The Kalarn won't stop until they have it." Max nodded, his mind racing. They had already lost so much. The city was a ruin, the world was on the brink of destruction. And yet, despite all of that, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle, the one that would define the future, was yet to come. "Astrid," Max said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "What if we can't stop them? What if we fail?" She turned to him then, her gaze softening for just a moment. For the briefest of moments, there was no war, no enemies, no Kalarn. Just two people who had found something in each other that couldn't be explained. Her hand brushed his arm, her touch light, but it sent a shock through him nonetheless. "We will," she said firmly, her voice steady once more. "We have to." Max looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood what she meant. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for their future. And he wasn't fighting for Earth. He wasn't fighting for humanity. He was fighting for her. And, somewhere deep inside, he knew that she was fighting for him too. They came to a stop at the entrance to the Kalarn core, a massive, metal structure that pulsed with a dark energy. The air around them seemed to hum with the power of it. The very ground beneath their feet vibrated with the force of the machines inside. Astrid turned to Max, her expression unreadable, but her eyes spoke volumes. In that moment, there was no fear, no hesitation. Only resolve. She stepped closer, standing so close that Max could feel the warmth of her presence. The pull between them was electric, tangible, as if the very fabric of the universe was conspiring to bring them together. "We face this together," Astrid said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Max reached out, his hand brushing hers, a touch so light, so fleeting, but in it was everything. The war, the pain, the sacrifice, the loss, all of it was in that single, brief moment. And somehow, that moment told him everything he needed to know. They were no longer just two soldiers fighting side by side. They were two souls, bound by something deeper than just survival. Max stepped forward, his hand still holding hers, as they walked into the heart of the Kalarn core. The light from the massive machinery flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost deafening, as they approached the heart of the enemy's power. And then, it happened. Without warning, a Kalarn warrior appeared, blocking their path. Its armored body was massive, towering over them both, its glowing eyes fixated on them. It lunged, its massive blade coming down with lethal speed. Max barely had time to react, pulling Astrid back, but the blow struck the ground where they had just stood. Astrid moved faster than he could follow, stepping between him and the Kalarn warrior, her energy crackling around her like a storm. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice filled with both authority and something softer, something that made Max hesitate. Before he could stop her, she raised her hand, and the world seemed to freeze. A massive wave of violet energy surged forward, hitting the Kalarn warrior head-on. The blast sent the warrior flying backward, its massive form crashing against the far wall of the core. Max stood there, stunned for a moment, watching as Astrid's energy flickered and dimmed. She was exhausted, her energy depleted from the constant fighting. But she didn't show it. She stood tall, unwavering. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice calm once more. But Max could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was pushing herself too hard, and he could feel it too. Max moved to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We will finish this together." Astrid turned to him, her eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to blur. There was no Kalarn, no war, no enemies. Only the two of them, standing together in the heart of the storm, ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment, Max knew there was no turning back. They had already crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. They were more than just warriors now. They were partners. They were bound together by a bond that transcended anything either of them had ever known. The core of the Kalarn base was a labyrinth of cold steel and humming machinery. Max and Astrid stood at the center of it all, breathing heavily, their bodies battered and worn from the endless battle. The weight of their journey, the pain, the sacrifice, it all came rushing back. Yet, as they stood together, side by side, there was something else, too. A sense of unity, a bond forged through fire. Astrid's violet eyes scanned the room, every inch of the Kalarn technology drawing her attention. She was silent, her expression unreadable, but Max could feel the tension radiating from her. She was preparing for the final confrontation, just as he was. "We're here," Max said, his voice low, steady. "This is it? The end?" Astrid nodded, but her gaze didn't leave the center of the room, where the Kalarn overlord waited. The creature was massive, its form a grotesque amalgamation of technology and alien biology, its red eyes glowing with malevolent energy. It had been waiting for them, knowing that this would be the final clash. The Kalarn overlord opened its mouth, a low, guttural sound vibrating the air. Max could feel the power emanating from it, the sheer force of its presence. "I've seen the way you fight, human," it rumbled. "But you cannot stop the Kalarn. We are unstoppable. And now, your planet will fall." Max's grip tightened on the hilt of his weapon. This creature, this force of destruction, had caused so much pain, so much loss. It wasn't just about stopping an invasion anymore. It was about revenge, about reclaiming their future. Astrid stepped forward, her eyes glowing with determination. She raised her hand, and for a moment, the room fell silent. A crackling, violet energy surged around her, the air thick with power. "You're wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "We will stop you. You're not the future of this galaxy. You're the end." Max could feel it, the electricity in the air, the connection between him and Astrid. They were fighting not just to save Earth but to protect what they had become. He had never felt more alive, more connected to anyone. He was not alone. Not anymore. They had come this far together, and they would finish it together. With a fierce battle cry, Max lunged at the Overlord, his enhanced strength propelling him forward. The Overlord's massive claws shot out, but Astrid was faster. She threw up her hand, sending a wave of energy that slammed into the Overlord, throwing it off balance. The two of them moved in sync, like a well-oiled machine. Max's fists collided with the creature's armor, each strike ringing through the chamber. Astrid's energy blasts lit up the dark room, each burst sending shock waves through the walls. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually win. The Kalarn Overlord stumbled, its massive form weakening under the relentless assault. But then, it roared. A deafening, earth-shattering roar that shook the very foundation of the base. The room trembled, and the Overlord's body began to glow with an unearthly power. "No," Astrid whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "It's absorbing energy. It's evolving." Max looked at her, fear flickering in his eyes. But Astrid wasn't afraid. She stepped forward, her energy crackling around her as she drew upon the last of her strength. "We can do this," she said, more to herself than to Max. "We have to." Max felt the same surge of energy rise within him. He reached out, his hand connecting with hers. The power between them was unstoppable. They were a force to be reckoned with, unified, both in body and soul. Together, they launched a final, devastating attack. Astrid's energy surged, and Max's fists pounded into the Overlord's chest. The creature screamed in agony as the combined force of their power tore through its defenses. The Kalarn Overlord collapsed, its massive body crumpling to the ground with a deafening crash. The room fell silent. Max stood there, breathing heavily, his hand still gripping Astrid's. Her violet eyes met his, and in that moment, everything else faded away. They had won. Together. "We did it," Max said, his voice a whisper of relief. Astrid nodded, her expression softening. But there was something else in her eyes. Something that had been there all along, something deeper. Max stepped closer, feeling the warmth of her presence. There were no more words needed. No more fighting. They had crossed a line between just surviving and living. They had become something greater, together. As they looked around the room, now free from the Kalarn's grip, they both knew that Earth was safe, at least for now. But more importantly, they had found something in each other, something unbreakable. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The battlefield was quiet now, but the silence was louder than any explosion. She lay there, her armor shattered, her pride broken by a weapon no one had taken seriously. And as the dust settled, Max looked down at her, not with victory, but with something more, a strange respect. "You never saw it coming, did you?" he whispered. Her eyes, once filled with arrogance, now reflected something different, surprise. Was it possible? Could one blow truly shatter everything she believed in? But the real question wasn't if she could recover. The real question was, what would they both become now? Max had just proven one thing: never underestimate what you don't understand. And so, they stood in the ruins, not as enemies, but something far more complex. What happens now, when the battle is over? What happens when everything changes, and neither of them is the same? This is only the beginning. The true war has just begun.